Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today is Professor Sebouh Aslanyan from Los Angeles. Professor Aslanyan, before I introduce you, thank you for joining us on CivilNet.
Please, thank you for having me. Thank you.
You are the holder of the Modern Armenian History Chair at UCLA, and you are the author of a book that's entitled From the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, the Global Trade Networks of Armenian Merchants from New Julfa. Other than that, that's a fantastic topic, and it would get us to discussions of the British East India trade and the British Empire. You have an interesting take on that theme, that these aren't just merchants involved in global trade.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You have another take on it. What is that?
The way I study them is primarily to situate them in the larger context of global history, world history, and the development of a global economy in the early modern period, which is roughly the period that extends from 1500 to 1800. So just to give some perspective to those who don't know anything about Armenian studies or early modern history, my interest is in studying Armenians in the context of how they interacted with larger forces than themselves.
We were global before there was globalization.
You could say we were very much, we've been a globalized people even before globalization, one could say avant la lettre. So one of the things that makes Armenian history really, I think, fascinating is that Armenians have been, to a large extent, we've been raised to think that we should stay within the boundaries of Armenianness, that the border, those who patrol the borders of what constitutes Armenianness have constantly told us throughout our history that it is imperative of us to actually stay within the boundaries of Armenianness.
And we've defined it as tightly and
as a nation and ethno-religious community and so forth. My take is that is interesting. To a large extent, we've kept our identity as Armenians and so on, but where we have really excelled in history is precisely in border crossing. Why? That is to say, boundary. We have been excellent boundary crossers. Why? I think it's not easy to respond to that, obviously, in the context of a short discussion, but I could say there are a couple of reasons at least. One, primarily, is that Armenians have, for the most part, been extremely gifted when it comes to languages. They've been polyglots. Language acquisition, multiple skills in languages, has been an avenue for Armenians, a window into different cultures. Along with linguistic achievements and so on, comes the ability, the adaptability to move in and out of different cultures. We have been ideal boundary crossers or border crossers, as the term, as the official term, to use the official term today, and that means people who constantly cross cultural, civilizational, regional boundaries and so on. And I think that really makes us, in many ways, a very ideal people whose history should be studied not within the narrow confines of exclusively national history, which has been for the most part how Armenians have studied themselves, but in the context of global history or world history.
I'm going to resist asking about the parallels today because it seems like we've kind of turned it on its head, but what are the other reasons, do you think, beyond polyglot?
For being
a successful border crosser?
I think cultural skills, the ability to be, the fact that Armenians are Christians, and yet at the same time we are indubitably from the Middle East. We partake in both Eastern and Western cultures, and our dispersion into multiple countries and cultures has made us culturally adaptable. I think in addition to language, that would be another factor, and most importantly, of course, the fact that Armenians have been exceptionally talented as a trade diaspora, as a mercantile community that worked successfully and simultaneously in almost all the early modern empires from the 1500 to 1800.
The Dutch, the British,
the Dutch,
the
Spanish, Portuguese, the French, just to mention some of the European ones, but also not to be forgotten, the Safavids in Iran, the Ottomans in what is today Turkey, the Mughals in India, as well as Muscovite Russia, Qing China. All the major empires were places where Armenians worked.
And we were seen as honest brokers.
Definitely. Yes, to a large extent, yes. We are extremely a trust-based community amongst ourselves. Armenians generally
amongst ourselves
tended to trust one another for multiple reasons that I can't go into at the moment. Not because they were Armenians, but because of other factors. We were also seen as reliable and trustworthy agents for others. To a large extent, that has to do with the fact that Armenians did not have a homeland or a state of their own, and hence were seen to be extremely trustworthy because they didn't pose a threat to rulers who patronized them and cultivated their friendship and their skills.
Do you have students who find all this fascinating?
I hope so, yes, I do. Actually, I teach a number of courses at UCLA, the usual survey of Armenian history courses. I also teach world history courses and Middle Eastern courses. And I do have loyal cadre of students who usually take my survey classes, and my emphasis in the survey classes for Armenian history is always to explore the interactive dimensions of Armenian history. In other words, not to overemphasize how Armenian history is autonomous from other histories, but to precisely do the opposite, which is to say to emphasize how Armenian history must necessarily be studied in relation to and in comparison with and in relation to other histories, in other cultures and so on. And that tends to resonate with the younger students.
I'm tempted to say that I wish that was an approach that was also common and used in Armenian educational systems below the university system, so that more of us, my generation, younger generations, would look at our history and our experience that way. Which brings me to my question, and that is that your students, are they students who dabble in Armenian topics on their way to getting an engineering or a law degree, or are they also students who want to specialize in Armenian studies? Is there a generation after yours?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. There is a generation after mine, I hope. After all, I think that is the most important obligation that people like myself have. That is to wish consciously that the younger generation will not only exist, but will surpass us in whatever talents that we may have. Otherwise, I don't see any purpose in engaging in this vocation. We certainly do not do it for the money. So we hope there is, and in fact there is, and I have one PhD student at the moment who is from Armenia, from Yerevan, and we're very, very happy to have her. She's among the best students in the entire department. I try to really go out of my way to cultivate relations with younger students, with younger future representatives of the field, so that they can not only make an impression on the field itself, but also on adjacent fields such as world history and so on.
And the hope of these graduate students, PhD candidates, PhDs, would be that they would find employment more or less in their field, researching, teaching, and perhaps working in educational institutions, if not academic. Do you see that happening more now than happened, when you and I were students at UCLA or other places?
Yes, I mean, if the future generation is going to be trained to be experts exclusively in Armenian history, then I can say the future will probably be quite bleak for them, because we only have, I think, around 10 chairs or so, and as you know, it's not a field that people are lining up to get into. But of course, if we were to emphasize the interactive dimension of Armenian history and to train the future generation of scholars to be experts not only at Armenian history or Armenian studies, but also Middle Eastern history, world history, and so forth, as any proper training ought to be, then that candidate could easily land himself or herself a prominent position in other fields. So I'm optimistic that actually a future generation, the one that I hope to train, will be very marketable in fields outside of just exclusively Armenian studies.
And marketable not just at the university level, but also at other levels and in other sorts of research and education.
Perhaps.
Positions?
I mean, most people do not do their PhDs in Armenian studies or any other field to be able to teach in high school. It's usually
I'm not thinking teaching so much. I'm thinking, our educational institutions after 20 years of independence, after 30, 40 years of existing, especially in the US, need, this whole conceptual sort of rethink, overhaul, and that requires, the ability to theorize, to conceptualize, to know comparative worlds. And that's what I'm hoping some of these PhDs will lead to. I don't know that anybody else is hoping, but I am.
I think we can be optimistic. I can say there might be many reasons to be pessimistic about the future of Armenian studies, but I think equally there are lots of reasons to be optimistic. And one of those reasons, the important reasons, is the fact that the young generation of Armenians, whether in Armenia itself particularly, or the diaspora, is actually a generation that is really talented. I think we need to find ways of harnessing and cultivating this young generation, giving them opportunities to thrive in ways that perhaps their predecessors were not able to do so.
Is there any sort of institutional organic linkages between the diaspora, the educational institutions of the diaspora, the academic institutions, and Armenia, in terms of finding, identifying, nurturing those potential Armenian studies scholars?
In terms of institutional linkages?
Institutional linkages, formal efforts other than Professor Aslanyan coming periodically and, meeting some students. Do we need those linkages?
We might. What we do need is, obviously we need more investment in scholarships. Luckily, in my case, in the case of the Richard Ovanesian chair that I currently hold, all students who apply and who get accepted are accepted on the basis of a full package scholarship. In other words, 6 years of study is paid for. If you're good enough to be accepted by my peers and so on, we are a team of people who actually make the decisions, then the accepted candidate is only accepted on the basis of receiving a full scholarship package.
Is it possible to assume, hope, think that some of these budding PhDs would also use Armenia as a platform to do teaching, lecturing, in order to bring some of that sort of approach to scholarship here? Is that something that can be mandated, that can be expected? Or is it really its own little 10-year process that then will have some crossover perhaps?
I think it's something that can be cultivated, definitely, and should be cultivated. We should cultivate intra-Armenian or trans-Armenian relations, particularly between the diaspora and the homeland. We should, hopefully, we will see in the next coming decade or two, more fruitful collaborations that are based on mutual respect and agreement for respecting certain differences. But I do see that as something that I think we can all agree that needs to be cultivated.
Those are good, hopeful words to end on. We do hope that happens, that's for sure. Thank you. We've been speaking with Professor Sebouh Aslanyan, who is the holder of the Richard Ovanesian Modern Armenian History Chair at the University of California, Los Angeles. And thank you for following us on CivilNet.